The Next Dimension. In this episode of the Omega podcast, we have an expert AI conversation on the evolution of artificial intelligence, the opportunities to leverage AI companions, and the different models that enable AI to serve humanity. Leap forward.
Welcome to the Omega podcast with Patrick Bangert, Senior Technology Executive with an industry reputation as an artificial intelligence and data science expert and business leader, experienced both in small entrepreneurial environments as well as developing and leading teams in a large global entity such as Samsung SDS. He has a strong track record in innovative design and development of new AI technologies, including patents, taking them to market, and turning them into profitable products. It is so great to have you on the podcast, Patrick.
Thank you, Keenan. Pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. I am so excited for our conversation on artificial intelligence, the changes that are happening in this rapidly evolving industry, but more importantly, about you and about your career trajectory being the Senior Vice President at Sears Incorporated. Can you share about your initial days starting your career? How did you find yourself in this particular path of AI, ML, cloud trajectory?
Yeah, so my path really started as a child with astronomy books lying around the house and me being interested how the world works and how it came to be, that stars and galaxies look so great on photos. I took a physics degree at university, and experiment was never really to my liking. They never really worked out. I didn't do those very well. So I got into theory, which in physics is a lot of mathematics. So eventually I went to the mathematics department, got my PhD there. But that then involved, ironically, data analysis. So physics is always a conversation between the people who do experiments and the people who do the theory, and then you have to analyze some data. And we chose in that sense to use this strange thing called neural networks, which in the late 90s, when we did this, really had the reputation of being a failed technology, right? Everybody had gone around in the 1980s saying, oh, neural networks are so fantastic. Then everybody tried it, they all failed. And then they said, well, this AI thing is just simply a failure. And that ended up with the AI winter referring to the fact that there was little funding available both commercially and governmentally for AI research. But we did it nonetheless. We found that it solved our problem, which was to forecast protuberances on the solar surface. When the sun releases a mass ejection and that disturbs satellites on the Earth. That was our project. Did that okay. So that was my first foray into AI back in the 90s when I did my PhD. Now, of course, fast forward to today, somehow AI made it back into the news, and actually the conversation sounds very similar to the 1980s. When the people inventing the technology were like, oh, this is the greatest thing since bread came sliced, it's going to solve all the problems and it's going to do it right away and it's fully automated and it's not going to cost you any human involvement. And it's a lie, right? Let's face it, it's a lie. So you got to cut through all that hype. But that's how I got started. And I then proceeded to have a professorship for applied mathematics for a few years. Started my own company, grew that, sold the business, eventually joined Samsung to lead their AI division, doing lots of things, but especially healthcare imaging. When you might take an ultrasound or a CT image and you want to know whether you've got cancer or not. Status quo today is it takes about 6 weeks for you to get a good answer back, and then that has a 30% chance of being wrong. AI would give you an answer immediately and have a very small percentage chance of being wrong. So there is serious upsides to using it for these kind of dedicated purposes. And 8 months ago, then I joined Sears, where I lead the business unit for AI, and another business unit for data analytics, we do consulting. So it's essentially all the professional services around those domains globally in the cloud. And that's what I do today.
Fantastic. I know throughout your response, it really opened up a door when you had discussed data sets, because I believe today there is so much data, unstructured and structured data available pretty much at our fingertips. Do you find it to be an exhilarating time to experiment with different AI development just because of the amounts of data available to end users? And if so, what sort of research or development do you kind of have in the pipeline for us to sort of be in tune for in the near future?
Yeah, so this is a really good point. How did AI become so successful and popular in recent years? It's mostly down to having more data, right? So one of the principal reasons why it failed in the 80s is we didn't have enough data. The other thing we didn't have is computational resources, enough just power in the box. Now with the GPUs and the better CPUs and the larger memories and all of that being way cheaper, we simply have the physical resources to do all of this. The third thing, which everybody always really emphasizes, but which really only contributed a small amount, really, is innovation in mathematics. The algorithms are different today than they were back then, but they're not very much different. So the principal weight of the success is really down to more data and more compute, a little bit of intelligence. And nowadays, the data that's being used for large language models is pretty much the entire internet, right? So it's not a joke when they say, first you download the internet, and then you train your model on that. It's literally true. Now you've got to ask yourself, well, the internet's a pretty big place, so that's a lot of data, yes. But is it good? Is it reliable data? Is it data that you can trust? Well, no, it's not, right? Much of what's on the internet is stuff that you wouldn't want to educate your kids on. Right? And that's exactly what the LLM is doing, right? It's a blank slate. It's like a baby, right? And then you proceed to teach it and train it, and that's the outcome, right? Do you want your kids to be educated on the internet, blanket across, right, with all the fake news and all the hate speech and all the discrimination and everything that's on the internet? Do you want that? No, you don't, right? But that's exactly what's happening with LLMs, right? So just more data is no good. You got to make sure that data is in some sense reliable and correct and true and fair and all the rest of it. And so you have to define what is it that you want, right? Which values are important to you? How important are they versus other values? Where do you draw the line, right? And that makes it very difficult, actually, and that therefore expensive, to generate data sets that are trustworthy. And that's a problem. At the moment, it is so much a problem that virtually none of the companies that make large language models actually do this, right? So even if you have lawsuits against social media companies that will remain nameless, that they have to do a better job of removing discriminatory posts, right? They're basically throwing their hands up and saying, we just can't. Because if you look at the number of posts that we have to look at and the staff you would need to hire to look at them, it's unaffordable. Therefore, we're not going to do it. That's a real problem, right? And so
Absolutely.
the rest of us who are the users of those social media basically have to put up with the fact that, hey, you're getting this thing for free. Beggars can't be choosers. Put up with it. Same thing with the LLM in reverse, right? You're just the user. You're going to have to put up with whatever it does, right? And so that's the point where we're at now, where this generative AI is the wild, wild west, unregulated. Governments are starting to regulate it, but it's at the very infancy stage of that, and so it's as yet completely unclear what rules are going to control this game. But in my prediction, that's where we'll see the next big step. The next big step will not be in hardware compute or in intelligence or in new algorithms or anything. It'll be in laws that govern this entire process, and then we'll see a step change again.
Absolutely. The legal system, the compliance protocols that'll be going into place to mitigate the discriminatory, large language models doing these specific outputs, it's so crucial. And I think it's so important that we sort of nudge it a little bit more, because I know even with the midst of tiny LLMs, it's still important as we think about, the motivations behind the development, right? Being able to understand, why we're developing these outputs. Can you sort of share some of the initial missions that perhaps Cirrus is using to help mitigate those issues? As you mentioned prior, with social media companies not mitigating, racial or discriminatory issues, what are some factors or some considerations that these developers that are creating these architectures should be aware about to hopefully mitigate those types of issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so that draws attention to the fact that the models themselves are not useful in their own right, right? So you have to put together what we call a pipeline of software tools from the input question that you provide all the way to the output result that you get. The stuff in the middle isn't just the model, right? But it's a variety of checks and balances. So for one of the easy things is to insert a filter that analyzes both your question or your input as well as the proposed output by the LLM against, like, does this include bad language? Is it, discriminatory against anybody? Is it sexually relevant? Is it violent, et cetera, et cetera? There are filters like that. They're not LLMs, right? They're separate things in and of themselves that simply judge, is that piece of text discriminatory or violent or something? So you then chain together these software systems. So you have a filter at the beginning, you have a filter at the end. Then you might have other filters. So for instance, if you're asking for facts, you might have a filter that checks the thing against a database of facts and figures and numbers and whatnot to make sure that, if you ask something to which the answer is 3 miles, is it actually 3 miles? Does that even make sense, right? And then of course you have to ask yourself, will it make a difference to me if it's 2.9 miles or 3 miles, right? And in that case, LLMs are just the wrong thing for you, right? Because they don't do that. They're not meant for arithmetic, for facts, for logic, for reasoning, for causal or common sense reasoning. They just don't do that, right? They're language models. So that's the other thing. A lot of people ask factual questions of LLMs, and that's just the wrong thing to do. Or they will ask things like, okay, if I eat meals of this kind, will I end up losing weight, right? It doesn't know about metabolism and medicine and nutrition. It's not trained to do that, right? So don't ask that. So those are some of the difficulties that are being caught by some of these filters that you can add, prior and post the method, and that's very helpful. The other thing, of course, is to interface it to other pieces of software where you might need it. So for instance, if you use LLMs as an interface to your computer, you would want it to have certain skills, right? So for example, we refer to the LLMs being able to fill in a form as a so-called skill, right? Like last name and first name and, comment and bio and things like that, right? Then it will know what those are and fill them in correctly for you, right? Those are skills. And of course, where everybody wants to go is the personal assistant, like, hey, computer, go book a concert ticket for me, right? It turns out that doing that is really, really complicated, right? Because you have to know a few things that to you and me seem perfectly obvious, but to the computer, they're not necessarily obvious. So for example, right, if I want to buy a concert ticket, it's probably in the San Francisco Bay Area because that's where I live, okay? So for the computer to propose buying a concert ticket in Tokyo is ridiculous. Well, we have to teach it that, right? Now, is it equally ridiculous to book it in LA? Well, not so much. I could actually do it. And if it's important enough to me, you know, I can make that happen. But then I'm going to need a hotel, right?
Right.
Now, to us, that logic is trivial, right? And it turns out that at the moment, for AI methods, that is beyond their scope. They can't, there comes a pretty easy level of complexity that completely overwhelms it. So we're not yet at that point, but it's these interfaces that are needed to really make it useful. And that's where you can also see the limitations of these things today.
Enjoying this episode of the Omega Podcast? We want to hear from you. Drop a comment and let us know. What are your takeaways from this AI discussion? Now let's jump right back to this future-centered conversation.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you highlighting these types of factors because it's only going to help us as we continue to move throughout the different iterations. And I recently had a webinar not too long ago, and one of the conversations that came up with some of the business owners was the issue that some of these AI chatbots have issues understanding different dialects from different languages across the globe. Where do you see there might be some opportunities to improve maybe understanding different dialects? Because I know through the different large data sets, there's a lot of manual input of information and it can be very time consuming and very laborious. But is it necessary? And I truly believe it is. Do you agree?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So dialects, of course, you have the, you know, the verbal dialect and then the written meaning of words. Both of which you have to somehow get rid of, and it's the words that are particularly tricky, right? So, you know, British people and Americans tend to use the same word in different meanings, right? And other people also, right? So, for example, I'm German, and so I know that, you know, German speakers, when they try to translate that into English, sometimes they literally translate, and then it only makes sense if you really think about it. But if that were a direct input into a computer, it would just completely misunderstand you, and lead to all sorts of problems. So absolutely, that is an important thing to do. However, how do you teach the computer that? AI relies on training data. Today, the overwhelming amount of training data is American. Why? Because the training data is the internet. Again, we're coming back to the same point, right? So the amount of training data in Zimbabwe and Timbuktu or whatever you have it is so small that it virtually doesn't exist. And therefore that entire culture, that entire way of using English language, their contexts and so on are basically lost. What LLMs are capturing is America, a little bit of Europe, and then it gets very thin after that. So that's certainly a problem that we have. But how to cure it? You cannot cure this problem through training because the data just isn't available. So how do you do it? It's a very tricky thing. So what's at the frontier of research right now is small data. I think all of us remember maybe 10 years ago or so, this concept of big data came up. You know, when you have so much data, now you can analyze the heck out of it and you can get all these results. Well, today we're doing the opposite. We're researching how do you get the most out of a very small data set that is somehow naturally small. In other words, getting more data is either very difficult or very expensive or just not possible. You got to make do. And that has really not been looked at in detail before. It's really curious. If you look at the AI literature, whenever anybody hit an accuracy limit and they were like, how do I get better? The answer is always get more data. Right? But what happens if you can't? Well, we don't know the answer to that right now. That's being researched, right? So ultimately, long-winded way of saying, we don't know, but we're really keen to find out.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited because as AI continues to mature, we continue to adopt different ways in its usage. I believe it's definitely going to improve our livelihood, but more importantly, it's going to be more personalized to our every single day needs. And one thing that I probably heard in a recent interview is that you're really keen to understand how these large data sets, or in our current era, these smaller data sets, are able to be hyper focused on the individual's needs versus just very vague and, you know, consumer based, if you will. Where have you seen some specific trends where AI has been used to be more personalized? I know that there's been adoption of AI companions, which sounds very futuristic, but let's be frank, we're using it if we want to agree to it on a day-to-day basis. If you use the different functions on an Apple phone, for instance, or I was talking to an Apple expert and they're going to be coming out with the Vision Pro spatial computing. And if you were to FaceTime someone, it's going to be in the essence of an AI companion, but it's going to be scanning someone's actual facial features and being able to imprint them as if you're actually talking to them. Have you seen that being an innovative tactic being used? Do you seeing it being a wide spread trend, or do you have any concerns about that? I'm curious to get your thoughts on that type of tech.
So if anybody of you listeners out there are willing to invest about a weekend of your time, you can create one AI model that reproduces your face in 3D virtually. You can get a second AI model that reproduces your voice very accurately. You can then create a third model, which takes a standard LLM, and you basically give it a number of the documents you wrote, give it some information about you, basically write a little bio about yourself, provide it all of that information as a so-called prompt, right? Now what do you have? You have an LLM that knows about you, you have a voice and a face to go with it. All of these things are now integrated. There's a virtual you. It's able to answer questions verbally, visually, online, and you're not even there, right? But how would you be able to tell whether the thing talking to you right now is actually me or my replica, right? You wouldn't, yeah? Unless you start asking me some tricksy questions that catch me out, right? So it's a Turing test problem now. This stuff is available basically almost for free, right? You can virtually ignore the costs of doing this. And I literally have a couple of friends that have hooked this up to their phone. You can call, quote unquote, them, they will answer. And as long as you restrict yourself to pretty simple topics, it is difficult to tell that they are not there. So it's being sold, of course, as a productivity tool, but you might as well imagine all sorts of bad use cases for this, right? I mean, it just got proven, I believe it was last week in court, that the Russian government influenced European elections as well as American elections with like 50,000 fake account on what used to be called Twitter, what's now X, and posting basically creative content that had nothing to do with reality. And that was manual, right, before Gen AI, right? Now that you have Gen AI, you can do that with orders of magnitude more accounts, more posts, more stuff, completely drowning out reality and the voice of real human beings. And of course, what also has been done recently, it's not entirely new, but it came up in the context of Taylor Swift, became very publicly known, right? That people have created videos with all sorts of content you don't necessarily want if you're the target, and of somebody doing something they never did, but there's video evidence, right? Realistic looking AI generated stuff out there, very difficult to tell the difference. You might imagine this being used in a political campaign, make your opponent say all sorts of stuff and it not being true. But by the time it's found out that it's not true, it's kind of too late. It's a dangerous thing. So I see that with lots of worries.
Yeah. Well, if anyone is taking notes of this conversation, use AI responsibly. Underline that, because that's really critical. And I think as we continue to investigate these areas and add more compliance and protocols, and I would consider it to be more taping in order to understand how to really precisely use these resources, not to destroy or to defame someone, but to actually really reinforce the importance of having an effective future or society, right? Because that's really what AI is supposed to be used for. I know we talked a lot about AI, and I know that you're an extremely technical guy, but I think for some of our listeners, they probably want to understand how you define success, being that you have been able to leverage so many different tools, have so much immersion with different types of research. At this point in your career, how do you define that this is a successful AI tool, or this is the epitome of what success should look like? Or do you feel as though you've reached there, or wherever there is for you?
You mean success in the sense of successful AI tool, or successful person, or career, or what do you mean?
I believe all of the above. If you can compartmentalize that, but I think it's good to start off with AI and then probably move to yourself, because AI cannot replace you, Patrick.
Not yet. Well, I mean, a successful AI model, that's fairly easy to define because that's built into the training process, right? But there you have to distinguish between an AI model that's scientifically good, which is what they're all trained to be, and the model that is useful and economical and ultimately profitable for whoever uses it. That's a different matter. And we find all over the projects that really the usefulness or the useful business benefit to anybody from AI rests mostly with change management and the people who use the AI rather than with the AI itself. The AI is a tool, right? Like I often say, if you want a beautiful kitchen, yes, you need a wrench. Whether it's this wrench or that wrench might make a small difference, but the thing that really makes the difference is the plumber who uses that wrench, right? So it's the same thing here. It's your people, your staff, or you yourself that make the real difference, and the AI is just the tool that you use to do it. Successful in terms of a career, it really depends what you want, right? I mean, if you take the classic picture of a successful career that's being advertised in business magazines and stuff, yeah, that comes at a cost of time and private life and things like that. So it's really up to the individual, and don't let yourself be manipulated into taking somebody else's definition, right? So I think it's mostly about being happy and contented and seeing an evolution in yourself as a whole person. That is the success. So I'm a practicing Buddhist. I meditate every day, and that is much more related to my definition of success and happiness than making money or producing good AI. Yes, that's satisfactory. It's part of my job. And in that, of course, I want to be good, right? So I have the ambition to be good at what I do, because that's also partly how I define myself, right? I want to be an expert. I want to be producing good things for good people.
Perfectly said. Who has been the most influential person in your life, and how did they impact you?
Very good question. I've had a few mentors in my career who've influenced me. I think at this point, of course, my parents were the first who influenced me a great deal. I got into martial arts at a very early age, and that kind of gave me structure and discipline, and partly why I'm able now to cope with a stressful job and manage lots of people is that kind of discipline, and doing one thing, finishing it, then doing the second thing, finishing it, and so on, rather than making a mess out of it. One of my mentors he used to be a famous Austrian mountain climber, the guy in 7 Years in Tibet. And he had a very interesting life and taught me lots of lessons. And his primary motto that I follow is have a plan and stick to it. So both don't do things haphazardly, have a plan, but also don't modify that plan all the time, right? So modification of the plan in itself becomes a stressful thing. And then if you're going to change it all the time, you don't really have a plan, right? So to help you in all the troublesome situations, have a plan ready, and then don't second guess it. Execute the plan, and you will get out of the other end all right.
Absolutely. Getting to the other end. And I think that that's where we're all trying to get to, wherever that is for each individual person. Where would you say is the next step for you in your career, in your life? I know that you're a father, you have wonderful kids. What's next for you in your journey?
Well, I mean, on the kids front, sending them off to college and making sure they get out the other end okay, that's important. So still got a few years to go for that. On my personal and professional front, I mean, we'll see what's out there. I'm now in a good spot with a consulting company. We'll see what's next after this. Hard to predict. Maybe I'll get a chance to serve on a board and be the AI representative there. So we'll see what's in store, but I think I definitely have a few more stations to go before the journey ends. So I'm looking forward to it. I think AI will continue to be my sort of topical focus, but what's important to me is how AI is actually applied in real life. And the technology is more and more commoditized. The value lies in how you use it, and that's really where I see myself as somebody who can give advice and make sure that it's organized in such a way that the value is real.
Absolutely. Well, this is my last question for you. What advice would you give your younger self before starting your career?
That's a tricky one. I would give myself the advice both to focus more. So looking back, I think it is better to be a specialist in something rather than to be a generalist. Of course, you have to specialize in the right thing, quote unquote, right? So it depends what you want and what your goals in life are. So focus is an important thing. And the other thing I would say is that career and business is a little bit like a chess game sometimes, right? You have to think a few moves ahead, and it's okay to sometimes make a move that looks like it's a step back. But you know that on the next move, it will benefit you even more, right? So it's okay, for example, to take a slightly inferior job at a company that will give you exposure and training and so on, so that after that you can then hit it. So think of it more strategically instead of just step by step on what you find right in front of you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Patrick, for being on the Omega podcast.
Thank you, Keenan, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Virtual reality, VR, is an immersive technology that allows users to experience a simulated environment that feels real. When wearing a VR headset, users are transported to a different world, where they can interact with virtual objects and characters. VR has come a long way since its inception, with advancements in graphics, motion tracking, and haptic feedback making the experience more realistic and engaging. It is commonly used in gaming, where players can step into the shoes of their favorite characters and explore virtual worlds. However, VR is also being used in various other fields, such as education, healthcare, and even therapy. With VR, users can visit historical landmarks, practice surgeries, or overcome their fears in a safe and controlled environment. It has the potential to revolutionize the way we learn, train, and entertain ourselves. As technology continues to evolve, the possibilities for VR are endless, and its impact on our lives is only beginning to be discovered.